Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly charged political debate that recently hit the airwaves on Sky News Australia. The core issue? The incredibly controversial return of Australian citizens who traveled overseas to join ISIS. It's a fascinating look into political rhetoric, legal maneuvering, and exactly how public safety concerns are communicated to the masses. To keep things completely objective, we're going to map out the specific claims and counterclaims across 5 key areas. First, the repatriation controversy itself. Second, evaluating legal powers. Third, comparisons and precedents. Fourth, the transparency deficit. And finally, the financial argument. All right, Section 1, the repatriation controversy, setting the stage. The catalyst for this whole debate is the impending arrival of another cohort of Australian women who went to Syria to support the Islamic State. And right out of the gate, this interview sets a fiercely combative tone. Shadow Home Affairs Minister Jonathan Duniam really doesn't mince words here. He openly accuses the current Labor government of being dishonest, saying that hearing them claim there's nothing they can do made his blood boil. So right away, we see this isn't just a standard policy disagreement, it's being actively framed as a serious breach of public trust. So what's really driving this clash? If you strip away the heated emotion for a second, it all centers entirely on a fundamental structural disagreement over what legal powers the Australian government actually has and, crucially, is willing to use in this specific national security scenario. Which brings us to Section 2. Evaluating legal powers, the core debate. The broadcast quotes the government's stance, specifically articulated by Julian Hill. And the government's defense is heavily rooted in constitutional law. They're essentially arguing that regardless of the terrible choices these individuals made to support ISIS, the government has very limited constitutional power to permanently block an Australian citizen from returning to their own country. But Senator Duniam, he's not buying that constitutional defense at all. While the government points to these constitutional roadblocks, the opposition is arguing that distinct existing legislative powers are just sitting right there at their disposal. They specifically point to temporary exclusion orders and provisions within the Passport Act, arguing the government is simply making a political choice to ignore them. In fact, Duniam lays out a clear step-by-step alternative that he claims the government should have taken. Step 1, utilize a brief of evidence gathered from previous returning cohorts. Step 2, use that evidence to slap down temporary travel bans. And Step 3, enliven those Passport Act provisions to entirely revoke their travel documents. Moving right along to Section 3, comparisons and precedents, framing the list. To really amplify concerns about community safety, the Sky News host draws a very stark, direct parallel to a recent legal precedent in Australia. They explicitly compare the returning ISIS brides to what's known as the NZYQ cohort. This was a group of released detainees who the High Court recently ruled could no longer be forced to wear mandatory monitoring ankle bracelets because the practice was deemed unconstitutional. The host is very deliberate in pointing out that this group included individuals convicted of severe crimes. The broadcast leverages that specific court ruling to pose a pretty devastating hypothetical to the viewers. The logic goes like this. If the government's laws for monitoring the NZYQ cohort were already struck down by the High Court, how can the public possibly trust their ability to safely monitor returnees with ties to a designated terrorist organization? It's an incredibly powerful rhetorical framing of the risk involved. Let's dive into Section 4, the transparency deficit, a barrage of unknowns. This skepticism feeds right into what the opposition frames as a severe transparency deficit regarding the actual on-the-ground logistics of bringing these women back. What's fascinating here is just the sheer velocity of rapid-fire questions the host throws out. Are they getting taxpayer-funded legal aid? What de-radicalization programs will be used? Do those programs even work? What specific communities will they be placed in? And what kind of welfare are they receiving? The broadcast uses this barrage of unknowns to paint a picture of a government that's hiding a lack of a concrete plan. Finally, we hit Section 5, the financial argument, contrasting costs. In the latter half of the interview, things shift to stark fiscal comparisons, designed to really heighten the emotional stakes. The host drops an absolutely massive figure into the conversation, claiming it's going to cost taxpayers $2 million per year, per ISIS bride, just to manage the return and monitor their de-radicalization. And then, almost in the same breath, that $2 million sum is contrasted with $5,000. The host states this was a defense stipend reportedly stripped by the Defense Department from the parents of Cameron Baird, an Australian who actually fought and died fighting against Islamic extremism. This brilliantly highlights the ultimate rhetorical strategy of the interview. By visually and verbally pitting the immense resources allegedly allocated to former ISIS supporters directly against a tiny cut to the family of a fallen veteran, the broadcast creates a highly potent narrative about misplaced government priorities. So what happens next? Well, Senator Duniam wraps up the interview by putting the government on notice. He promises to vigorously pursue every single one of these unanswered legal, logistical, and financial questions during the upcoming Senate estimates hearings. He's making it clear that this debate is far from over. As the opposition prepares to press the government for answers in Parliament, it leaves all of us with a really profound question to chew on. When a democracy is forced to deal with the deeply challenging reality of repatriating radicalized citizens, exactly where does the balance lie? How do you weigh constitutional limits against national security powers, all while satisfying the taxpayer's right to total transparency? It is a complex, high-stakes intersection of law and public trust, and we'll definitely be watching as it continues to unfold. Thanks for exploring this one with me today.